the most decisive naval battle of World War II.
The Americans are in terrible shape.
Most people would have bet on the Japanese.
Victory in the Pacific is hinging on an upset.
Every single aircraft in the squadron is shot down.
It's not good for the home team.
A demoralizing defeat for the U.S. will spell disaster.
I'm not only fighting for me and my family, but the whole country, the whole world.
Using authentic battlefield footage, cutting-edge graphics, and eyewitness accounts from the heroes who survived. This is the stunning victory at the Battle of Midway, as never before told.
You rock and roll and shake stem to stern.
June 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan is planning a deadly follow-up attack. The target? The American base on the Pacific island of Midway.
The island of Midway. It's about 1,100 miles away from Hawaii. It could be used as a launching pad for an invasion. Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, reasons that if he attacks at Midway, the Americans will have to react to that. Their carrier force will come out, and also the remaining battleships, he believes. He'll be able to bring those forces into a final decisive battle, destroy them, and then hopefully the Americans will throw in the towel.
June 4th, 5:45 a.m. A routine U.S. patrol plane spots 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers heading toward Midway under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu are all battle-hardened veterans from the attack on Pearl Harbor. 6 a.m. At the U.S. Air Base on Midway, 10 planes are scrambled and head out. 6 TBF Avengers, 4 B-26 bombers, all armed with torpedoes. Their mission? Take out the Japanese carriers. At only 17 years old, Radio Man Third Class Harry Ferrier from Torpedo Squadron VT-8 is in position in the belly of an Avenger.
Our primary mission was to find the Japanese ships, then to attack.
With Midway itself in danger, American commanders hold back their fighter planes to defend the island from attack. Harry Ferrier and the Torpedo Squadron are on their own and desperately vulnerable.
The aircraft really needs to enter battle with a fighter escort. They went in an uncoordinated attack, meaning that they went in torpedo bombers by themselves with no fighter cover. For Harry Ferrier, he's in a position where he can't really see inside the belly of the aircraft, where his only view is through the hatch that he entered the aircraft. He also has a position for a little .30 caliber machine gun they called the Stinger that defended the lower portion of the aircraft, and he could look through there as well.
We had just barely got in the air when a turret gunner called over the intercom and said, "Hey, I just saw a Japanese airplane." And then the pilot, it looked like a lot of Japanese airplanes heading for Midway.
Harry's airplane is right in the path of a massive coordinated Japanese air attack. Not just 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers and 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, but also 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters to protect them. Unlike the uncoordinated American attack, it's a devastating display of air power.
They put up 108 aircraft, and they do it in 10 minutes flat. They're very, very good at this.
With orders to hit Midway, The Japanese strike package passes the U.S. bombers without attacking. Harry's squadron are just flying into deeper danger. A second squadron of Zeros are circling the Japanese carriers, waiting to take them down.
Those planes show up at about 0700 to attack Nagumo and are immediately set upon by the Japanese Combat Air Patrol.
The turret gunner is behind me up above in the turret. And I hear him fire his .50 caliber machine gun a couple of times. I could hear what sounded like bullets or something hitting the airplane. It's kind of like ice on a cold day on the roof. And then the turret gunner had been hit, was hanging loose in the harness. Pins are hanging down. One finger had been severed. He was already dead.
Japanese Zeros are swooping in time and time again, straightening the aircraft and filling it full of holes.
With a top speed of 330 miles per hour, the Japanese Zero is faster than the Avenger's maximum speed of 278 miles per hour. The Zero has two 20mm cannons in the wings and two 7.7mm machine guns mounted on the front of the plane. Their pilots are experienced, disciplined, and feared, bringing down a rain of fire on the Americans.
I saw one airplane go by that looked to be on fire. I couldn't tell if it was one of theirs or one of ours. I felt a hot thing slash on my wrist. Looked down and it looked like a bullet wound.
He's in the aircraft, he's wounded. Bert Ernest is hit, the tail gunner is killed.
Next thing I was hanging down, blood pouring off my head, almost making me blind.
Without the protection of fighters, the U.S. torpedo planes are easy prey for the Japanese Zeros, and within moments, their squadron is ripped apart. The bombing raid is called off, and those that can try to make it back to base alive. Japan's strike package of 108 planes closes in on Midway, preparing to drop land bombs on the U.S. airbase. The Japanese have the advantage of surprise. They're dangerously close to Midway before the Americans have time to launch a response.
The American defenders have put up Wildcats and Buffalo fighters, and they are just cuffed aside by the Japanese fighter escorts, the Zero fighters that are coming along with the strike package.
The base is now hazardously exposed.
Midway is level bombed with their torpedo planes and then dive bombed by the Val dive bombers as well. The results are that they blow up some of the refueling facilities, they demolish some of the hangars.
Mission accomplished. The Japanese planes return to the aircraft carriers to refuel and reload. There, Admiral Nagumo is planning a second attack on Midway. This will clear the way for ground troops to land.
Nobody really knows how to fight these sorts of battles. The whole business of an opponent being completely out of sight of our ships. How do you scout for the enemy? Where is that person? How do I direct forces over there? It's a brand new art form. This is sort of the Wild West of naval systems. That's what carrier warfare is at this point. It's like trying to fight a battle by remote control, blindfolded. It's very, very difficult.
The only U.S. counterstrike to find the enemy so far has been disastrous. From the 10 planes that set out, only one is still airborne.
decided I was still alive, and I did get on the intercom, talk to the pilot. I said, it looks to me like Jay is already dead. There was no point in staying where I was in that bloody mess. I asked the pilot if I could move up into the seat behind him.
Harry Ferrier's TBF Avenger is riddled with bullets. The rear gunner's dead, and Harry and the pilot are seriously injured. Fighting for their lives, they need to land the plane immediately. Midway's reeling from the Japanese attack. The base in chaos. Harry Ferrier's Avenger is circling in the sky above.
Sitting up there, I could see what was going on. Both saw the smoke coming off of Midway. They knew that the pilot hadn't got all the landing gear down, and they didn't want him to land on the runway and mess it up. But they had called him on the radio trying to tell him to bail out. He said, "The hell with them, I'm landing again." And he circled the airfield several times. On the third pass, he landed.
Against all the odds, Harry and his pilot, Bert Ernest, managed to land on Midway, wounded and exhausted.
Somebody off the ground came up and started holding on to me to help me off the airplane. Of course, they could see I had been wounded. They said, "Boy, you're lucky you're still alive."
Nagumo's first strike has crippled Midway. Another Japanese strike will finish it off. But unknown to the Japanese Navy, their communication codes have been broken, and the Americans are moving into position to strike back. June 4th, 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan seeks to land the knockout punch by hitting the U.S. base on Midway Island hard. Expecting the attack, the U.S. have secretly stationed 3 carriers 175 miles northeast of Midway. USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown are in position, ready for a surprise ambush of their own to take out the Japanese carrier fleet. The commander of American operations in the Pacific Theater is Admiral Chester Nimitz. His plan is to launch a coordinated attack as soon as the Japanese carriers are within striking range. Waiting for his mission aboard carrier USS Enterprise is experienced dive bomber pilot Dusty Cleese.
I slept just like a top. I went to bed, and the next thing I knew, I was wakened by the corpsman. 4 of Japan's very best aircraft carriers going to be at this particular location. All of our dive bombers will be together and make an attack against the 4 Japanese carriers.
American intelligence puts the Japanese fleet 200 to 250 nautical miles northwest of Midway. But without sophisticated radar, it's impossible to be exact. The plan is to launch every aircraft available in the hope of finding and hitting the carriers. Dusty flies a Douglas SBD Dauntless.
I went in to take a look at my airplane, and it was horrible. It only had a 500-pound bomb and 2 100-pound bombs.
SBD dive bombers are normally equipped with 1,000-pound bombs. However, with so many planes on deck, there is less runway available. The planes are fitted with lighter bombs, so they can take off over a short distance.
In order to get as many planes in the air as they wanted for this strike, they had to launch them in 2 separate shifts.
The Americans are not as experienced in carrier warfare as the Japanese, who launched on Midway in 10 minutes. It's going to take the Americans far longer to get in the air.
As those aircraft took off, They also just couldn't take off one at a time and fly off toward the enemy. They had to rendezvous.
Those aircraft have got to be circling over the aircraft carriers, burning precious fuel, while you're waiting for the second group of aircraft to be put up on the flight deck and launched off as well.
Dusty's SBD is now airborne. While the Americans struggle to match Japan's efficiency with carrier operations, their Douglas SBD Dauntless planes are perfect for one of the Pacific Theater's most destructive offensive techniques, the dive bomb. The Dauntless's handling and armament are superior to any other dive bomber, precision aiming during the high acceleration dive. But if Dusty's plane runs out of fuel before reaching its target, it'll be just another casualty at the bottom of the Pacific.
We were just circling and circling around the ship. 6 o'clock had long passed. It was now getting to be 7:30.
With each passing minute, the element of surprise starts slipping through their fingers. They also run the risk of the Japanese fleet moving out of striking range.
Neither of our two skippers are leading the group, it's somebody else. And I got close enough to see this was McCluskey.
Dusty's trusted and experienced dive bomb leader has been promoted and is replaced by ace fighter pilot Wade McCluskey.
Wade McCluskey was one of the best fighter pilots in the Pacific. He'd never done any dive bombing with us, and he was leading the pack. McCluskey knew that the Japanese were going to be in a spot for a particular time, you know, so we went figuring, well, maybe they continued that course. Finally, we circled, and we were an hour and a half late.
With half their planes now dangerously low on fuel, the U.S. squadrons arrive at the location to find no sign of the Japanese carriers. The carefully prepared U.S. surprise attack is going horribly wrong.
The Americans are in terrible shape. If things continue going as they are going, it's not going to look good for the home team.
7:35 a.m. The Japanese are preparing to finish off Midway. During the first raid, Admiral Nagumo kept a number of aircraft in reserve in case a U.S. naval fleet was located. Now that a second attack is required, he decides to send these planes to strike. But first, he must rearm them with anti-land bombs.
Nagumo gives his rearming order. It really only affects the torpedo planes in Akagi and Kaga. They've got to have their torpedoes taken off, mounting hardware changed, and then finally you attach an 800-kilogram bomb to the underside of the plane. So on Soryu and Hiryu, there's really not that much activity. Kaga and Akagi, there's chaos.
Nagumo's planes are out of action for 30 minutes. Unknown to Nagumo, this whole time, the American dive bombers are in the sky, still looking for the Japanese fleet.
McCluskey flies a search vector to where he thinks the Japanese fleet should be, and when he rolls into that neighborhood, all he sees is sea, sky, and clouds. There's not a ship in sight. This is a very bad thing because his fuel gauges are already dipping down precipitously and the Japanese are nowhere to be found.
McCluskey takes one of the greatest gambles in air combat history. He decides to keep going in the hope of finding the Japanese and takes his squadron northwest. Better to go down fighting than turn back.
As soon as we started making the search, two of the planes ran out of fuel and sat down in the ocean.
The mission looks like another calamitous failure for the U.S. until finally a ship comes into view.
We saw a destroyer about 20 miles away going full speed, about 40 knots. And of course the wind hitting on it just made like a rainbow. That turned out to be the Arashi. So we knew he must be heading back to his fleet.
McCluskey's gamble pays off, and the sight of the Japanese destroyer gives the pilots renewed hope. There's now a chance that they may find their targets before their fuel runs out. 8:30 a.m., June 4th, 1942. After bombing the U.S. base on Midway, the decks on the Japanese carriers are alive with activity as they prepare a second strike to complete the job. On board the Akagi and the Kaga, torpedo planes designed to attack ships are being rearmed with land bombs. On the other two carriers, the decks are busy, landing and refueling the returning strike package. Believing the American carrier fleet is still in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo feels he is safe from attack.
When they take these torpedoes off or these bombs back off, they're not stowing them down in the bomb rooms in their magazines. They're just leaving them out on the hangar decks, which means that both Akagi and Kaga are just strewn with various munitions on those hangar decks.
They were in the middle of doing that when suddenly one of the patrol aircraft reports in American aircraft carrier sighted. That causes the Japanese then to suddenly stop and rethink. Nagumo was confronted with a worst-case scenario.
This is a crushing blow to Admiral Nagumo. His plan to secure Midway first, then use it as a base to destroy the U.S. fleet, is no longer possible.
Suddenly, the American aircraft carriers have appeared at the worst possible moment. Nagumo was to stop rearming the aircraft for the land attack and go back to the weapons that would be appropriate for attacking American aircraft carriers.
Making matters worse for Nagumo's fleet, the Americans have already launched an attack and are closing in.
If you look at who improvises more effectively during the course of this battle, it's clear that the Americans are much better at thinking on their feet than the Japanese are.
We followed the Arashi, and he led us exactly to the aircraft carriers we'd been waiting for.
10 a.m. Two squadrons of Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise are approaching the Imperial fleet. Wade McCluskey leads in front with Dusty Cleese. The squadron led by Lieutenant Dick Best trails close behind. The targets they have been searching for, the Akagi and Kaga, are finally in sight.
McCluskey is coming in from the southwest. All he sees in front of him is two big Japanese aircraft carriers. So his decision now is how to allocate his forces. He's got two squadrons, he's got two targets. He'd like to hit them simultaneously if he can, so that they don't have a chance to evade.
McCluskey has never led a squadron of dive bombers before, so he doesn't know the golden rule.
Leading squadron, which is McCluskey's squadron, should attack the farther target, which would be Akagi. The trailing squadron, which is Lieutenant Best's bombing squadron 6, should go after the slightly closer target, which is Kaga.
McCluskey started wiggling his wings, indicating we should follow him and join this closest ship, which was the Kaga. Meanwhile, I was near the head of the pack, and I had to give all the codes to the other people. And I had looked down our bombing 6, instead of being back behind us, they were 5,000 feet below us. Something's wrong with the oxygen system on all of the bombing 6 airplanes. So they were dropping down to 15,000 feet instead of 20,000 feet, where they didn't need any oxygen.
Lieutenant Dick Best, the commanding officer of VB-6, has lost contact with McCluskey.
Best was down below, and he didn't hear any signal different. He figured he would hit the closest carrier.
Now, not only are they failing to attack both targets, but there's a real danger they could collide with each other on their way in. Suddenly, Lieutenant Best realizes something is wrong. He makes a split-second decision.
Lieutenant Best pulls out of his dive. He manages to pull two of his wingmen out of their dives, and with those three planes, he goes off and he attacks Akagi.
With Lieutenant Best out of the firing line, Dusty Cleese has a clear line of fire to dive on the Kaga.
I knew that if we did not win that battle, the United States was going to be in real jeopardy.
With the fate of America in the hands of the dive bombers, Dusty doesn't have a moment to lose.
We just started dive bombing the Kaga.
The real fun starts when you actually get into the dive. This is essentially a very noisy, very chaotic, very high-speed roller coaster that you're on. You start your run at about 15,000 feet. You ease down into a slight descent so you can pick up some airspeed. So you come down to about 12,000 feet by the time you're right over your target.
They call it a 70 degrees, but that's because the wings are moving you forward. And you know that you're in the vertical dive when you're not touching anything and your seat belt is holding you down. And then, of course, you have to watch the altimeter, which is going around so like a top.
You're diving on the target for less than a minute. You're coming down at about 225 knots. You're shedding appalling chunks of altitude as you're going down.
If the altimeter says 4,000 feet, you're already at 3,000. It can't go as fast as you are.
Dusty Cleese's plane is now plummeting vertically toward its target at 276 miles per hour.
You are suddenly going from being very cold in the airplane to being very hot. The bomb sights will be fogging up from the condensation because you're changing temperature so rapidly. You're being shot at by every gun that the Japanese can bring to bear on you. Smoke and shrapnel all around you. You're under 6 or 7 G's worth of pressure. You may almost black out, and you're going to hold that dive all the way down to about 1,500 feet before you release your bomb.
If a 500-pounder hits the center of the deck and sets off secondary explosions of fuel and ammo, just 3 or 4 bombs are needed to sink a carrier.
The 500-pounder hit the big red circle. I dropped the 200-pound incendiaries into the same spot. To make the pull-out, you immediately pull back on the stick as hard as you can and keep your pedals so that you don't go sideways and crash. It's just boom, boom, boom. Fast, fast, fast.
The Kaga's deck is cluttered with rearming aircraft, fuel hoses, and stacks of ammunition for various missions.
The 500-pounder went just underneath the deck and set the planes in the hangar deck on fire into a great big inferno.
Dusty Cleese has hit the Kaga. Lieutenant Best has hit the Akagi. And the Soryu is hit by dive bombers from the Yorktown. In only 5 minutes, America manages to turn the tide of the Pacific War toward possible victory. But they are not out of harm's way just yet. As pilot Dusty Cleese pulls out of his dive bomb, he suddenly spots a lone Zero hurtling toward him. Dusty's trusted rear gunner is John Snowden, known for his deadly accuracy.
He was even a better shot than I was. That's why I picked him. And I could tell something was wrong back there. And then he'd go pointing and I'd give him the perfect shot. There was one perfect angle where he'd get him that quickly. I turned just a little bit left so John could get him. And then John shot him down.
With the immediate threat eliminated, Dusty checks how successful his hit on the Kaga has been.
By this time, I was a fair number of miles away. I circled the fleet, and as I got around 180 degrees, I looked back. I saw this great big thing go way up into the air. I wondered, well, what in the world could that be? My incendiaries had melted down to the 4th deck, and they had set the long lance torpedoes down there on fire. They had all exploded. And that's what took the forward elevator and threw it a half a mile high into the air.
Nagumo himself is now trapped on the bridge of a burning aircraft carrier, and it would seem that he is just unable to really get his mind around what has just happened. looking around at the ruins of what had been the finest carrier force on the planet, and now all of a sudden, if you're on Hiryu, you're the only carrier that's left in the battle. Nagumo with Hiryu alone have now got to go off and somehow even the odds.
Admiral Nagumo knows his best chance to find the position of the U.S. carriers is through their returning dive bombers. Dusty Cleese must avoid being followed on his way back to the USS Enterprise.
I still had enough fuel left to know that if I really was careful, I could go directly to the dogleg attack towards Midway and back to the ship instead of going directly there, because I didn't want to let the Japanese know exactly where we were.
But some of the other dive bombers decide differently.
They're all running low on fuel. Rather than flying a dogleg course as they depart the action area, those aircraft flew a straight line directly back to where they would find the Yorktown and the Enterprise. The result of that was that it provided an indication as to the direction that those American aircraft carriers could be found.
If Dusty Cleese is to reach his carrier before running out of fuel, he must avoid any further confrontation with the enemy.
As I came down all these planes from the Hiryu, the dive bombing planes, and they had a bunch of Zeros with them. Then I saw 3 of the Zeros break off. They were heading directly toward me. Whoa! I said, boy, this is the end of me. Then all of a sudden they were called back. The group figured it wasn't worthwhile to use the gasoline to jet one plane.
It turned out that we were at the extreme edge of our range, and not surprisingly, a lot of these guys ran out of gas. So a lot of them end up ditching. A number of them end up, barely making it back to the carrier.
The dive bombers have been up since 2 a.m. that morning and are exhausted. Dusty makes it back to the USS Enterprise in one piece. For some of these heroes, returning is not an option. They have no choice but to ditch, facing almost certain death. "12 noon. On the USS Yorktown is 21-year-old photographer Bill Roy.
It was my job to take the pictures.
18 dive bombers from the Hiryu show up. 7 survive to launch a vicious strike on the Yorktown. In a split second, the Yorktown is a smoking mess.
We got one bomb down the bow into the rag locker. And the bomb storage and torpedo storage are all right there. Everything is burning, and we had to put those fires out.
Repair crews work frantically to bring their ship back into operational condition. With the deck of the Yorktown in chaos, she's hit by another Japanese dive bomber. Dusty is back on the Enterprise, watching in horror.
The Yorktown was almost to a stop. And with the hole in the deck, the Yorktown planes couldn't land, so they landed on the Enterprise.
The executive officer and his crew came up, and in 20 minutes, they put down planks and boards, and they're back in flight operations. The planes below, they were gassed up and bombed, caught fire from the bomb blast. So they had to put out those fires.
Unknown to the Americans, more Japanese planes are heading for the Yorktown.
They come across an American aircraft carrier that seems to be operating at a good speed and appears to be undamaged.
This time, the Japanese have launched their torpedo planes armed with lethal Type 91 aerial torpedoes, the best in the world. Highly advanced, They can control rolling movement, the biggest breakthrough in aerial torpedo development, invented in 1941. They can move fast in the choppy Pacific Ocean.
A very loud, sharp crack. An explosion. Two of them hit ship. He picks that sucker right up and you rock and roll and shakes stem to stern.
The next thing I saw was this great big wave that come up.
Japanese torpedo pilots end up hitting the Yorktown with 2 torpedoes, and they put her out of business.
It blew out the generators. It was very stressful. You're working in a strange environment when you have all this damage. I thought the ship would roll over because the hangar deck was in the water.
With the carrier dead in the water, the men aboard abandon ship before they are sucked into the ocean.
I was pulled out to a destroyer. I got aboard that, and they flopped me on the deck, and I just like a wet fish or something.
You're looking at the scorecard at this point. The Japanese are at a disastrous disadvantage.
The Japanese don't realize America has 2 aircraft carriers left, the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet.
The Americans have got 60 or 70 dive bombers still left operational, whereas the Japanese have only got 25. So at about 2:30 in the afternoon, one of Yorktown's scout bombers is out looking for the Japanese fleet and comes across the sole remaining carrier, which is Hiryu, and sends back what is undeniably the best sighting report of the entire battle. Just nails the position absolutely down.
If the Americans are quick to respond, they can claim a decisive victory.
My plane was loaded up. 25 of us took off, this time led by Earl Gallagher.
The fate of the Americans is in the hands of a squadron of exhausted pilots who have cheated death once today. Now they're being asked to do it again. 2:45 p.m. After the one remaining Japanese carrier is sighted, Dusty Cleese and Earl Gallagher are sent out on their second dive bombing mission of the day.
The Japanese still had a bunch of fighters and they were attacking us.
The Japanese are prepared to defend their last remaining carrier with everything they've got. But the American attack will not be turned away.
A radioman gunner named Adkins was near the front of the pack and everybody could see the Zero coming at him. One of his 30 caliber machine guns had broken loose and he pulled it up like a shotgun. He shot down the Zero and it went down in flames.
Through a constant hailstorm of enemy bullets, the American planes get close enough to the carriers to begin the bombing run.
They had their anti-aircraft guns, everything else, you know, all operational. And just as Earl Gallagher started to dive, the Hiryu made a really fast left-hand turn.
Gallagher doesn't have time to adjust the path of his dive, and his bomb misses the target. If the Japanese lose the Hiryu, they lose the battle. The pressure is now on Dusty Cleese to hit the target and finish off the job.
But I had figured out exactly how ships operate when it moves around this circle. Where's the center of gravity? What's the speed? I aimed where the ship was going to be on that turn. It hit right on the bow, but just picked up the deck and it flew it backwards just like a taco. The number 2 plane did the same thing, hitting the same spot. All those planes were on fire. It was just a great big smoking mess.
The Hiryu limps through the next night and sinks during the day on June 5th.
U.S. airstrikes have disabled or sunk all 4 of the Japanese carriers. Throughout the night of the 6th and into the morning of the 7th, the USS Yorktown remains stubbornly afloat.
We circled the Yorktown all that night, and the next morning I had the aerial camera, so I made 19 pictures of the Yorktown sinking. We're all teary-eyed and blurry-eyed and so forth.
June 7th, 7:01 a.m. The ship turns over on her port side, rolls upside down, and sinks 3 miles to the ocean floor.
It becomes pretty apparent by the 7th that the Americans are simply not interested in being lured into any sort of a different affray. The Americans by now know that they've won the battle, and they've preserved the island of Midway.
Japanese losses in the Battle of Midway were significant. They lost not just 4 aircraft carriers in the Mikuma. They lost 4 aircraft carriers with all 4 air groups on them. They lost hundreds of aircraft. They lost thousands of men. And standing in stark contrast with that are American losses during the battle. We lose the Yorktown, and we lose aircraft in the great exchange of aircraft carrier raids. But the reality is that our losses are significantly lighter than the Japanese losses. We turned the enemy back and suffered lighter losses. There can be no better definition to victory than that. Prior to the Battle of Midway, the Japanese had been on the attack. After the Battle of Midway, the Japanese fundamentally changed their approach to the Pacific War. After Midway, it was no longer a war of expansion and territorial aggrandizement. After Midway, it was a defensive war.
Finally, Yamamoto just shut it all down and said, we can't go on. Without our carriers, we do not have the ability to project air power. We can't protect ourselves against American air power. Trying to fight with our surface units against their air power is a hopeless task, and so he eventually, calls off the operation.
I liked the Navy. The Navy was good to me. When you survive a battle like that, I don't know if you say you're lucky, man.
I would have done anything for these other people, like my best friend in the torpedo squadron. His chances of survival are almost 0. It just breaks my heart just to think about him.
At only 26 years old, bomber pilot Dusty Cleese hits 2 of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, a huge contribution to America winning the Pacific Battle. He is now the last surviving dive bomber from Midway.
I'm not only fighting for me and my family, but the whole country, the whole world, really. This is what must be done.